Now, when you think single malt, your mind probably does not go made in China, but that is exactly where these samples I have are from. So join me as I taste a selection of single malt whiskies that are made in China and see if China is going to be the next big whiskey country. Hey guys, I'm Nate Martin, the Whiskey Scribe. I'm a whiskey enthusiast and I love all things whiskey. But taste is subjective. There's a lot of different whiskies out there, and sometimes even from countries that you might not expect. So whether you consider yourself a connoisseur or you're just looking to understand more about whiskey, let's explore it all together. If you want to see more from me, hit the subscribe button. I put up regular whiskey review videos and some educational pieces. You can also follow me over on Instagram. So now let's talk about Laju Distillery. Laju Distillery is located in Qingla, Sichuan, China's millennia-old liquor town. This is a big investment project. So the distillery was built with a planned annual capacity of 36,000 tons of spirit, which represents almost 80% of China's whiskey production. It took 5 years to plan and develop the 146,000 square meter distillery, and they began laying down barrels in 2021. And by 2024, they had laid down 400,000 casks and aim to reach 1 million within 5 years. So this is huge. Their mission is to craft China's own whiskey, blending traditional techniques with Eastern terroir. They've been experimenting with different cask types, which include Mongolian oak, Hyangju casks, which is like a Chinese rice wine. They're also trying to promote a connection between whiskey and Chinese culture and lifestyle. And so to do that, they've created all these Laju bar experiences opening up throughout China. And earlier this year, they launched a whiskey-themed tourist park at the distillery, which is really cool. Take me there rather than Disneyland. Now, of the 3 samples I have to try, they are all classed as single malts. None of them have age statements, but in China, there is actually a legal requirement for whiskey to be aged for 3 years before you're allowed to call it whiskey. Now, I have a beautiful glass provided by the distillery. It's got I don't know if you can tell, there's a really nice actual blend of blue going through into the glass. I love that, and it has the logo on the front there with the Chinese characters. I don't know if you can see that. But the samples, because this is really, really new to Australia, the samples do not actually have any of the branding on it. These were handwritten and sent to me by Altitude Attitude Beverages. So if you're interested in trying these, and if you want to stock these, that's who you would talk to. But I'm going to kick things off with the Laju Finest Select. So this is 40% ABV. It's using the distillery's signature multi-cask integration. So it's meant to create like this depth and complexity using a lot of different cask types. Among the multiple cask types selected, one of them is Chinese fortified wine casks. It's meant to subtly weave inspirations from Eastern flavor traditions into the Western character. So using these diverse casks, it's meant to create sort of like this delicate note reminiscent of Chinese rock tea. I don't know what Chinese rock tea is. I've never had Chinese rock tea. If there's notes of Chinese rock tea in this, I'm probably not going to be able to pick them out. But anything else, I'm willing to give a go. So straight away, look, ooh. Wow. If you've watched many of my review videos, you'll hear me harp on about the legs and the fact that the oilier a whiskey is, the more chance it has to hold onto the flavors from the cask. This has thick legs. Love me some thick legs on a whiskey. Yeah, look, I swirl this around the glass, and the rate that it's running down, it almost looks like honey. It looks like I've taken some honey and just mixed it with water. That really excites me. I have high hopes now that there's going to be quite a bit of flavor carried across in this. Yeah, let's just check out the nose. That nose initially always comes across like there's not much there, but it's soft, but really, really complex. There's a lot happening in there And it's all just in this real harmonious thing that almost makes you think that it's all blended. Well, it is all blended together, but because it's so soft and delicate, it almost makes you think that there's just one note. But there's a little bit of fruit happening in here. I know that their notes say red apple, which really did interest me because I very rarely see red apple as one of the notes for a whiskey. You often get things like green apple, crisp apple, but very rarely will they say red apple. And yeah, there is that almost like the slightly earthy sweetness of a red delicious apple happening in there. There is a faint, there's a dry sort of note that I'd almost call it like this little bit of like the dryness that you get in like oolong tea. Maybe that's similar to where you rock tea. But yeah, there's some earthy spicy notes happening in there as well. It's really intriguing. Gonna have to go in for a taste. Ganbei. Look, the first thing I'll say is smooth and very light. So much like the nose, the first impression is that it's very delicate, very soft. But when you sort of pay a little bit more attention, it kind of opens up. There's this creamy texture going on in there. There's some fruity sweetness, but again, kind of like it's not sharp and crisp in the way that you will get like things like lemon and sort of like zesty or melon sort of notes in things like a Scottish whiskey. The fruity notes that are happening in here are much more earthy. So I think, I don't know, like not to the same sweetness level, but like the flavor profile is kind of more like your really, really ripe stone fruits. And that fruity flavor sort of keeps going on the finish, kind of like a little bit dry, but it's really it's a very different whiskey because so many of the notes in this are coming across kind of like what you would expect from a Scottish whiskey, but different. So that sweetness on the finish, I mentioned that it's dry. It comes across dry in the way that a sherry aged whiskey will come across as being dry. But it's not the sherry aged whiskey sweetness. It's that kind of earthy, maybe orchard or stone fruit sort of flavor. This is really well rounded, but it is so different. When I try a whiskey from a new country for the first time, this is the level of difference that I'm excited to experience. That's really, really cool. Wow. Okay, I'm genuinely super excited about that. I'm going to taste the other ones. Unfortunately, I only have one glass, and I don't want to have to like keep getting up and polishing out the one glass. So the rest of these whiskeys are going to be in your standard Glencairns. So this is a peated whiskey. This is the Laju STR red wine cask. So the STR stands for shaved, toasted and recharred. It's very common if you're going to be using wine or fortified wine casks for whiskey that you're going to shave out a layer of the barrel. You're going to toast it, which is applying heat to sort of caramelize some of the natural sugars and things that are in the wood. And then you're going to char it, which is the coolest part of the process. You are literally taking a flamethrower to the inside of the barrel. If I knew that was a job option when I was in high school, I would be doing a very different career path. So it's been aged in red wine casks that have been shaved, toasted and recharred, and they do this in-house in their own cooperage. The peated malt does come from the Scottish Highlands, so there should be that recognisable smoke happening, and it's bottled at 46%. And like I said before, there's no age statement, but we know that it's at least 3 years of age to meet Chinese standards. So. Okay, again, so we've got like a golden, slightly copper sort of note to it. You're not getting a super red hue, but that's because you've shaved and toasted those red wine casks. And those thick legs are there. Love me some thick legs on a whiskey. But yeah, let's... So the fact that the last whiskey used such a huge multitude of barrels definitely had a big impact on the flavor, because this completely different sort of nose. Completely different nose, but it's not what I would expect to get from a red wine cask here in Australia. So I'm getting these sweet notes. It's plummy. There's this plum sweetness to it. Now, I mentioned that this one's a peated whiskey. I'm not really getting much smoke on the nose, but that plum note, and even like there's a little bit of vanilla in there as well. But that sweet, almost caramelized plum note is so prevalent. It's not too much, but I'm not picking up the smoke in the background of it. So I don't know how much peat they've actually used to do this whiskey. But that's okay, because I really like it when somebody balances peat with other flavor notes. So if this plum sort of carries across on the palate and it's nicely balanced with smoke, where it's not, where the smoke isn't too overpowering, that's that sort of balance that I want. But it's really intriguing. I'm going in. Gambay. Wow. I mentioned that on the nose there was this really, really prevalent plum note, and that plum was almost caramelized or, you know, preserved. That sweetness carries across, but I would expect that to be more of like a sweet, like almost like a candy sort of sweetness based on that nose. But what's coming across again is this dry sort of sweetness, more like that dry sweetness you get from a sherry cask. The smoke is there, but the smoke almost sits separate. So the smoke doesn't infuse with that sweet plum note, that dry sweet plum note. The smoke sort of is kind of more woody, and it's like the two of them are sort of running in parallel. The finish lingers, so they do mention that on this one you're meant to get like a little bit of dark chocolate on the palate. I get a little bit of that sort of like that residue on the finish that you tend to get, like, you know, where you've eaten a piece of chocolate, you've finished it, and then you sort of breathe out and you still get that chocolate sort of flavor on your exhale. That's what I'm getting on the finish of this, except the oiliness of the whiskey is making that come across as almost like a little bit nutty. But yeah, that's really interesting. I think without the peat, that sweetness might have been like a little bit sharper, but the peat just adds the perfect balance to really round this out. That is a fantastic whiskey, but it's fantastic in a completely different way to the first one I tried. This is really exciting. I'm really enjoying this. I had no idea that Chinese single malt was going to be so delicate and balanced and well done. Again, I'm not saying this because I was given the samples for free. Genuine actual impression of the whiskey itself. But the last one that I have here is the Lazoo bourbon cask. Now, normally if I was going to present a lineup of whiskeys in a whiskey tasting, bourbon, if I was comparing bourbon cask with things like red wine cask and things like that, the bourbon would probably be at the beginning, because you're going to get like a little bit less flavor notes coming across. But this is 50% and it's peated. So this is why I've left this one to the end. So I'm expecting, actually being a bourbon cask, I don't know what to expect now, because the casks that we used on those previous two were so impactful on the flavor because they were both so different to each other. It'll be really interesting to see what this one comes across as, because a lot of people sort of treat bourbon casks as the best indicator of what the spirit from a distillery comes from, because you've got the least sort of impressions from the barrel coming across in the whiskey. So as you would expect, because this is a bourbon cask and peated, it has a very, very light straw sort of color. What you would expect from an Islay single malt. Those wonderful thick legs are still there. But yeah, that's a very light color. There's a lot more smoke on this one. There's a lot more smoke on the nose, which I'm loving. And you're getting that ashy white pepper sort of smoke that you get from Highland peat. Yeah, I have to taste this one. Kanpei. Of the three, this is probably the most Scottish tasting whiskey. So the initial flavor you get on the palate is just honey and ashy smoke, which is beautiful. It's wonderfully mixed. It's actually sweeter than the other two. However, like as you really let it develop, as you sort of go through a little bit more of the exhale, there's some faint background fruity notes happening in there. I've mentioned in the past that I personally do not like eating apricots, but I love it when I find an apricot note in whiskey. Don't ask me why, but there is the fruity note that's in the background of this, once you sort of like clear the smoke, is that little bit of apricot. And the bourbon cask is letting you sort of get a little bit more of the flavor of the spirit itself. So you're getting a little bit of this sort of like biscuity malt happening. But honey and smoke and a little bit of apricot would be like the primary flavor notes that I'm getting from this. But there is this, yeah, the oiliness gives it this little bit of chewiness. Yeah, I'm actually glad that this was the last one I had, because the first two were so different to anything that I've had before in terms of whiskey. And this one is very, like, there's only like a few little flavor notes that make me think that this is in any way different to a Scottish whiskey, which isn't a bad thing. It actually shows some good quality to like what they're actually doing. But like I said, like if I'm trying a whiskey from a different country, I want to be trying something different, something unique, something that's different to the standard that we're expecting from everywhere else. This one, it's still different, but it's close to that, which is a great sign that they're on par with the Scottish whiskey. But those first two are absolutely sensational. So if you're looking to try Chinese whiskey as an alternative to Scottish whiskey, go for the Laju bourbon cask. It's perfectly nice. If you like peated Highland whiskies, absolutely delicious. They used a lot of peat, a lot more peat than I was expecting. But if you really want to try something different, the Laju red wine cask really has that real sort of plummy note, but done in a completely different way. And then the, what was the first one? The Laju Finest Select, just that combination of all the different barrels. I'd be really interested to see what a whiskey drinker who also loves Chinese tea would say about that one, because I'd love to know how much of those tea sort of flavor notes did actually come across in it. But if Laju Distillery is going to represent 80% of the Chinese whiskey making market, they're off to a really good start. This is delicious. This is not it's okay for their first attempt. This is just good. This is up to a really high standard. So if you've got any hesitation about trying whiskey from a different country, throw that to the wayside to try these ones, because genuinely, I'm impressed. I was really expecting to have to be saying they're good for a first start, but they've got a way to go. But they're in the level of quality that I would be hoping they would have gotten to within about 10 years. So I cannot wait to see what else they're going to do. I would actually really love to try I think they've done a few premium releases, like select casks and things like that. Whiskeys like that, I would absolutely love to try from them, because these are so unique and different from each other. Each one is very notably different. I would love to see what else they're doing. I can't recommend trying these highly enough. If you want to explore other countries' whiskies, start with La Jus Distillery. That's fantastic. Thank you so much for sending me those samples. I'm really happy to have tried them. Enjoy what's in your glass. Enjoy it so much that there's next to nothing left. And Cambay. Damn.